In this presentation, I will examine how I introduced small changes into my practice using a trauma-informed and UDL lens. I will discuss how I identified a need in my own classroom practice and highlight the changes I hope to make to address these needs. I will explain the steps I took in order to plan and implement these changes and reflect on the impact that it has had on myself and my current learner group, if any. Finally, I will explore how I hope to use a transformational leadership approach to create a more learner-focused and inclusive environment within my own centre. The parameters of this assignment required me to examine and reflect on my own practice and identify areas that could be improved by a more inclusive and trauma-informed focus. In order to do this, it is important that we first look at what trauma is. Trauma can be defined as a term used to describe the challenging emotional consequences that living through a distressing event or series of events can have for an individual. It is also important to note that traumatic events can be difficult to define because the same event may be more or less traumatic for some people than it is for others. Harris and Fallett describe trauma-informed practice as a framework for human service delivery that is based on knowledge and understanding of how trauma affects people's lives and their service needs. This was a concept I initially struggled to identify with in my own setting, given the fact that much of the research appeared to focus on migrant, refugee, and early school leavers, demographics that did not mirror my current learner group. However, as Carello and Butler tell us, trainers should assume that in virtually every classroom, some unknown subset of learners will be at heightened risk for re-traumatization or vicarious traumatization as a result of personal trauma histories, mental illness experiences, and current challenges or difficult life transitions. And it is Johnson that says that due to the prevalence of trauma inside and outside of educational settings, teaching without a trauma-informed approach can cause harm and negatively impact learning and organisational outcomes. Given the stage of the year that we were currently at when undertaking this activity, and based on various redesigns I had already made to my practice to be more in line with UDL principles, I thought I had unconsciously embedded a trauma-informed approach to my teaching already. The realisation that I had not came after I was approached by a close colleague who had been dealing with a learner who was upset after one of my classes, something I was taken aback by. The learner had spoken to my colleague, not to me directly, after an exchange where he wished to remove himself from the class to work on other projects, and I expressed concern for him missing information so close to the assessment, and suggested that he linked in with Pierce afterwards to see what he had missed. His response was unexpected to me, and although Minahan tells us that we should expect the unexpected, I was not prepared for the response. It was at this point I realised how this exchange had triggered a trauma response for this learner, because, as Carello and Butler point out, trainers need to be aware that a learner's reluctance to participate may be an instance of self-protection rather than a resistance or evidence of lack of preparation. A trauma-sensitive educational practice involves a flexible approach which recognises the prevalence and signs of trauma in students, as well as a response that resists re-traumatisation. And Mortenweiler tells us that the traumatised learner has a more difficult school experience, and in educational setting, academic performance, classroom behaviour, and social relationships are negatively affected by trauma. Having considered both of these views, it became clear that although my current learner group may not have experienced the larger, more easily recognisable traumas, that they still may have experienced trauma in their own right. And having reflected further on this and collaborating with my colleague within the same subject area, the following observations were apparent. Although we are a large centre with 3 buildings that includes many student areas such as a library, canteen and student common room, our sports students spend the vast majority of time within our sports centre, where there is little student support available. This environment didn't lend itself to a safe space where our learners felt comfortable. So this was identified as our first action point. The second action point was identified through my classroom practices and the seemingly harmless content that may still had triggering effects, and so a need for aesthetic distance within the delivery was required. So, what could I do to fix it? Furtenweiler states that the ultimate goal of a trauma-informed approach is to create a physically and psychologically safe learning community that allows trauma victims to let down their guard and enables them to focus on learning. And it is Skiba that tells us that the physical training environment characteristics must also be considered, as they may be triggering for some learners. For our first action regarding a safe space, we identified that the way in which to do this was by changing the physical environment. This included having the walls and floors painted from brighter, harsher colours to more muted, subdued colours, by having blinds placed on the windows, and by putting shelves up where books and posters could be hung. We also developed a second classroom next to the main hub, which allowed for an additional space for the learners to use. For the second action, relating to aesthetic distance activities, I incorporated the use of third-party examples and personas while discussing topics that may otherwise be triggering, and incorporated the use of anonymous collaborative tools such as Padlet, Mentimeter, Microsoft Forms, and Nearpod Collaborate boards. So implementing these changes, our first action was around creating our safe space. Changing the physical space of an educational setting is not simple, given many restrictions and the scarcity of space. However, the classroom layout is important in promoting a feeling of safety for our students, which we attempted to do by seeking management approval and support, by deciding and sourcing materials, paint, blinds and shelves within the budget that we had been provided, and by creating a timeline that allowed the works to be carried out, providing the least amount of disruption to the learners and to other teachers using the room. For Action 2, Aesthetic Distance, Corello and Butler outline some basic strategies that trainers can use to reduce the potential to re-traumatise or vicariously traumatise learners. These include previewing material and eliminating content, developing warnings, having regular check-ins with learners and adjustments made depending on their emotional state, and implementing policies and practices to learners to help them avoid feeling shame. The tasks that I undertook in order to create this change was a review of our upcoming content that was left to be delivered, the removal of any personally focused or triggering questions or material. For example, looking at the individual's personal experiences within a gym as opposed to general. And the inclusion of third-party personas and examples, anonymous options for engagement and for feedback through the use of Padlet, Mentimeter, Nearpod and Microsoft Forms. Following the implementation of both actions, I provided differentiated feedback options for my learners to try and ascertain how successful they had been. The options included a Microsoft form issued to the learners in all of the affected class groups, informal group discussions held during class, a Padlet wall posted to their Moodle page to allow for anonymity, and a feedback box left in the classroom. The feedback responses collated overall were quite positive. The change in room colour and layout was well received, and students identified a sense of calm had been established. The second space was welcomed, with the students identifying that it felt like somewhere to wait for classes and to get work done if the main hub was in use. And they felt that there was less fear of being wrong was the largest motivator for them in the use of the anonymous engagement activities. Following this, I embarked on some personal reflection. Within this, I see that the overall changes appear to be successful, but only time will tell. I'm aware that more conscious examination of content and materials is needed to identify hidden barriers or triggers within, and a more trauma-informed approach is needed to be developed much earlier on so that trusting relationships and safe feelings can be developed. I also feel I need to be a leader both within my classroom and within my centre in order to elicit a more trauma-informed change. So, what next? Trauma-informed practices in adult education are a relatively new way to create safe learning spaces where traumatised learners can reshape their learner identity. In order to create trauma-informed education spaces, we need to support trauma-informed education and best practices in teaching pedagogy, including teaching and learning practices, curriculum design and delivery. And we need to support and formalise trauma-informed educational practices within all faculties and departments, including student services. Within my own centre, I feel there needs to be a more considered approach taken when planning for our next cohort of learners. We need to have an integration of aesthetic distance exercises right from the outset, alongside the UDL guidelines. And I plan on highlighting a trauma-informed approach to colleagues at our upcoming staff community of practice and CPD events, creating space for colleagues to explore, develop, support and guide each other through inclusive practices. So in conclusion, trauma-informed practice is increasingly recognised as important in providing trauma-affected students with access to resources and opportunities that promote learning and growth and, in turn, positive educational and professional outcomes. And everyone can play a role in implementing trauma-informed education, no matter what their position, level of knowledge or experience may be.